Part 2, Database and API. In this part, I'll focus on the backend of the application, specifically the database structure and the API that connects the front end to the backend. The backend uses MongoDB with three main collections: users, accounts, and transactions. The users collection stores essential information like names, emails, and roles. Accounts contain details such as account types, numbers, and balances. Transactions track all financial activities such as deposits and withdrawals. These interconnected collections enable efficient data retrieval, such as displaying user account details on their dashboard. Data abstraction layer. The DAL implemented through services and models in Express.js and Mongoose separates database logic from business logic, keeping the code base maintainable. For example, when creating a new transaction, the DAL updates the account balance and records the transaction accurately. I implemented role-based access control, storing user roles in the database. Transactions are stored in a separate collection to support advanced queries and scalability. The DAL was extended to handle these features, ensuring efficient and secure data operations. I implemented a RESTful API for communication between the front end and back end, adhering to REST principles for scalability and statelessness. API endpoints. API auth login handles user authentication, verifying credentials, and returning a token upon successful login. API users register manages user registration by validating data and creating a new user record in the database. API accounts facilitates account management, allowing users to create, retrieve, and manage their accounts. API transactions manages financial transactions, including deposits and withdrawals, ensuring data validity and updating account balances. API design secured with middleware for authentication and authorization, ensuring only authorized users access specific endpoints. Data validation is also in place to maintain integrity. API documentation. I thoroughly documented using Postman, which provides a clear interface for developers. The documentation includes endpoint details, required parameters, request response formats, and authentication mechanisms, simplifying testing, integration, and maintenance. The next 4 slides consist of screenshots of Postman's API documentation for 4 endpoints. API documentation is essential for ensuring that developers can easily understand how to interact with the API, what each endpoint does, and how to correctly format requests and responses. On this slide, the API users register endpoint. Here you can see that the HTTP method is post. You can see the URL, headers, and body. And on the right side, you can see the response on the lower right. And in the actual API documentation maintained in Postman, I saved an error response for each of these endpoints for error handling. And the next few slides consist of the API auth login, API accounts, API transactions. Now let's take a closer look at the endpoints in Postman. On the right panel, I have the Bank App API collection which contains 4 key endpoints. I'll send a request now to log in as an existing user, and we can look at that response. So I'll be demonstrating the API auth login endpoint. The HTTP method is post. The URL is the Heroku link with the API auth login endpoint. The headers are content type application JSON, and the body contains the email and password. If I click on the send button to execute the request, I see the success response with a status of 200 OK. Okay. I can view the documentation where I've added details about this endpoint. I've outlined everything a developer needs to know about this endpoint. The response from the recent user login request matches the success response in this documentation. I added an error response to the documentation for error handling by modifying the request and used an incorrect password to trigger an error. And I can see the error response in the documentation with a status of 400 bad request, and the response message is invalid credentials. And this type of documentation was added for all of the endpoints. Middleware plays a crucial role in my application, particularly in securing and validating data. Authentication middleware checks if a user is logged in before they can access certain routes, while authorization middleware ensures they have the right permissions. Data validation middleware checks that incoming data is in the correct format and meets the required criteria. These middleware functions are very important to the API's functionality, ensuring that data flowing into the backend is accurate and secure. The API.js service file abstracts the API requests, making it easier to interact with the backend from the front end. The service file centralizes all API calls, streamlining the process of fetching data or performing actions like transactions. The database and API are the backbone of the application. MongoDB stores all user account and transaction data in a structured manner, while the API, powered by Express.js, facilitates secure and efficient communication between the front end and the back end. Middleware ensures that this communication is secure and that only valid data is processed. This setup provides a robust foundation for the application's functionality.